Richard leaned back in his seat, glancing around at the passengers on his flight from Chicago to Detroit. Normally, he'd be traveling with his usual suit and briefcase, but as an undercover federal agent, he knew the importance of blending in. Today, he was dressed in jeans and a plain t-shirt, hoping for a quiet flight. Just as he settled in, he noticed a woman seated in first class. She was heavily adorned in expensive jewelry, her expression marked by disdain as she sighed and complained about the minor inconveniences around her. She'd been giving the flight attendants a hard time since she boarded, demanding special treatment and criticizing everything from the seating to the complimentary beverages. Richard rolled his eyes, deciding to ignore her. But not long into the flight, he overheard her escalating a complaint over a can of soda. "I specifically asked for sparkling water," she exclaimed loudly, her voice grating and persistent. As the flight attendant tried to explain that they had run out, the woman, whose name he'd overheard was Miss Ruthie, muttered a few choice insults under her breath, enough to make the flight attendant visibly uncomfortable. Richard put on his headphones, trying to drown out the ruckus. He'd encountered people like her often, entitled, rude, and determined to make everyone around them miserable. But before long, her attention shifted directly to him. Richard had just stood to stretch when Miss Ruthie's gaze zeroed in on him. "Excuse me," she snapped, waving her hand in his direction. "You need to sit down, you're blocking the aisle." Her tone was demanding, and her glare was hard to ignore. "I'm not in the aisle, ma'am," Richard responded calmly. "I'll be sitting in just a moment." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't ma'am me," she retorted. "I've been watching you, acting like you own the place. You people always think you can do whatever you want." The words stung, and Richard felt his jaw tighten. He dealt with prejudice before, but in a confined space like this, surrounded by watching eyes, it felt particularly isolating. The other passengers looked away. Clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene, Richard kept his voice steady. "I'm just trying to fly like everyone else, ma'am. There's no need to make this into something it isn't." But Miss Ruthie's face twisted with anger. "People like you always think you're entitled to everything," she sneered, her voice dripping with condescension. "If it were up to me, you wouldn't even be on this plane." Richard stayed calm, but inside, he was seething. He'd encountered hostility and bigotry plenty of times, but it never became easier. He remained seated, determined not to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. A man seated nearby finally spoke up, unable to tolerate her behavior any longer. "Lady, you need to calm down," he said, his tone firm. "You're out of line." "Don't tell me to calm down," Miss Ruthie shrieked, her voice even louder. "I paid for the seat, and I deserve respect." The tension in the cabin was palpable as passengers began to murmur, nodding in agreement with the man who had spoken. It seemed like the tide was turning, yet Miss Ruthie wasn't ready to back down. "I'll have all of you thrown off this plane," she shouted. Just then, the pilot emerged from the cockpit, his authoritative presence immediately calming the chaos. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "you need to return to your seat. This behavior will not be tolerated on our flight." For the first time, Miss Ruthie hesitated, her eyes scanning the cabin. She seemed to realize that everyone, from the passengers to the crew, was against her. Grudgingly, she sank back into her seat, shooting Richard a final look of disdain. Richard took a deep breath, his fists unclenching as he leaned back, grateful that someone had finally intervened. As the flight continued, he couldn't help but think about the silent strength it took to endure these moments. He remained composed, his thoughts drifting to his assignment and the task ahead in Detroit. But little did Miss Ruthie know, she had been needling a federal agent the entire time, a fact she'd likely never know. Richard adjusted in his seat as he watched Miss Ruthie continue her tirade. He had been seated near the back of the plane, minding his own business, when she first caught sight of him. For Richard, a veteran agent with years of experience, keeping his cover and composure in situations like this was second nature. But Ruthie's brazen behavior was testing every ounce of his patience. Miss Ruthie, who looked every bit like someone who was used to getting her way, had made herself the focal point of the entire cabin. Dressed in a bright blue designer dress with gold jewelry draped over her neck and wrists, she looked more suited for a gala than a flight to Detroit. Her voice cut through the hum of the airplane, carrying her entitled demands from one end of the cabin to the other. After her initial outburst, the flight attendants had gently, though uncomfortably, tried to pacify her, but Ruthie had no intentions of calming down. Her pointed accusations were now directed squarely at Richard, who was only a few rows behind her. She tilted her head back to glance at him again, her eyes narrowing with a mix of disgust and accusation. "Are you all blind?" Ruthie screeched, her voice grating. "This man is clearly up to something. I've seen his type before, thinking he can sneak his way onto this plane and make everyone else uncomfortable. We need to know who he is. Show us some identification." She pointed at Richard, her finger trembling in anger. The flight attendant approached her yet again, a look of weariness in her eyes. "Ma'am, please sit down. This is a peaceful flight, and we're asking you to remain seated until we land in Detroit." "Are you even listening to me?" Ruthie yelled, her face turning red. "He doesn't belong here. He's dangerous. I can just feel it." Richard kept his face blank, though he could feel his muscles tensing with every word she spat. He glanced around at the other passengers, who were visibly uncomfortable. A few shot him sympathetic glances, while others looked at him with a mix of concern and confusion, caught in the woman's web of accusations. The situation escalated further when a man in a suit, sitting a row across from Ruthie, finally had enough. He stood up, his eyes blazing with frustration. "Enough, lady. You're the only person making anyone uncomfortable on this flight. Sit down and mind your business." Ruthie's mouth opened and closed, stunned for a moment by the sudden rebuke. Then, regaining her composure, she glared at him with pure venom. "How dare you speak to me like that? I am a paying customer. I deserve respect." The man rolled his eyes. "Respect? You're the one causing a scene. We're all just trying to get to Detroit in peace." Ruthie turned her gaze back to Richard, her eyes narrowing. She seemed determined to make her accusations stick. People like him, thinking they can slip into society without anyone noticing. We should be vigilant about who we let on board. Richard closed his eyes momentarily, gathering his thoughts. He reminded himself to stay calm, even as he felt the surge of anger coursing through him. His instincts screamed at him to confront her, to put her in her place, but he knew better. He had been trained to deal with volatile situations, to handle people who saw only what they wanted to see. A young mother seated in the aisle across from Richard finally spoke up, her voice laced with frustration. "Can we just continue this flight without all this drama? No one here thinks this man has done anything wrong, except you." She cast a sympathetic glance at Richard, who nodded gratefully. Ruthie's rage only grew. "Oh, I see. All of you are just blind to the obvious. Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you all." She plopped down in her seat with a huff, her arms crossed as she glared ahead. Just as the cabin seemed to settle back down, another announcement crackled over the intercom. "This is the captain speaking. We've been made aware of a disturbance in the cabin, and I'd like to remind all passengers to please remain seated and allow our crew to assist you." Ruthie glanced up at the speaker as though she'd been validated by the captain's voice. With a triumphant smile, she looked back at Richard. "See? Even the captain knows something's wrong here." But the real drama was about to unfold. Richard, sensing this ordeal wasn't quite over, leaned back and pulled out his wallet. His FBI credentials, a small laminated card, gleamed as he casually opened it on his lap, letting it rest where Ruthie and anyone nearby could see it if they were paying attention. When Ruthie's eyes finally caught sight of the credentials, her self-satisfied grin wavered. She blinked, momentarily thrown off balance as she struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. Her mouth opened slightly, her expression morphing from anger to confusion. You're an FBI agent?" she stammered, her tone suddenly less assured. Richard looked up at her, meeting her gaze calmly for the first time. "Yes, ma'am," he replied evenly. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd stop accusing me of being a threat to this plane and its passengers. Now I'd suggest you take your seat, follow the crew's instructions, and let the rest of us have a peaceful flight." Ruthie's face flushed deep red as the weight of her mistake sank in. She looked around at the other passengers, who now openly glared at her with a mixture of contempt and satisfaction. The man in the suit chuckled, unable to hide his amusement. Without another word, Ruthie sank back into her seat, her mouth pressed into a thin line as she looked anywhere but in Richard's direction. The rest of the flight passed in silence, save for the hushed murmurs of passengers who could finally relax now that the disturbance was over. As the flight continued, Richard could feel the tension in the air gradually dissipate. Passengers exchanged quiet words, some casting wary glances at Ruthie, while others gave him nods of solidarity. He appreciated the support, though he remained focused, watching Ruthie from the corner of his eye. He could tell her indignation hadn't entirely faded. She sat rigidly in her seat, arms crossed, her face still flushed from the humiliation of discovering his true identity. Just as the plane began its descent into Detroit, Ruthie finally spoke, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "You know, this isn't about you being an agent or not. It's about people thinking they can just show up, blending in where they don't belong." Richard looked at her sharply, her words lingering in the air, tinged with a barely concealed bitterness. "It sounds like you have some pretty rigid views about who belongs where, Mississippi?" "It's Ruthie," she snapped, though her earlier confidence was noticeably dulled. "And you don't get it. People like me, we have to work for our reputation. It doesn't just come with a badge or some fancy credentials." "Work for your reputation?" Richard repeated, an eyebrow raised. "Funny, I thought respect was earned by how we treat others, not by making loud accusations to feel superior." Ruthie's mouth tightened, but she held his gaze for a long moment, almost as if trying to find some retort that would salvage her dignity. But before she could speak again, the young mother who had spoken up earlier leaned over and addressed Ruthie. "You know, I don't usually get involved in strangers' business, but I couldn't help overhearing your views," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Maybe it's time to reevaluate what you worked for. Respect isn't about what you wear or who you know, it's about basic decency." Ruthie's face turned a deeper shade of red, clearly unused to being openly challenged. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, evidently at a loss for words. The young mother, satisfied that her point was made, turned back to her child, brushing off Ruthie's presence as if she were inconsequential. A small ripple of murmured agreement spread through the nearby passengers, giving Richard an unexpected sense of camaraderie. It seemed that Ruthie's judgmental antics had touched a nerve with more than just him. Finally, the plane landed, and as it taxied to the gate, Richard prepared to disembark. He couldn't help but feel a strange satisfaction at the prospect of leaving this incident behind. But as he rose to grab his bag from the overhead compartment, Ruthie surprised him by standing as well, her eyes avoiding his. "Listen," she mumbled, barely loud enough for him to hear. I'm sorry. I thought. Well, I guess I misjudged you. It's just, I don't know. I thought you were different." Richard looked at her for a moment, trying to decipher her half-hearted apology. "You're right," he replied, his voice steady. "I am different, Miss Ruthie. Just not in the way you assumed." With that, he turned and walked toward the exit, his steps purposeful and his head held high. The passengers parted for him respectfully, nodding or offering small smiles as he passed. It felt like a quiet acknowledgement, a collective understanding that a lesson had been delivered, albeit in a rather unconventional way. As Richard stepped off the plane and into the busy terminal, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He had no intention of letting one person's prejudices affect him, but it was satisfying to know that, in the end, he'd left her with something to think about.